Welcome to the second of my bedtime stories. My name's Jane Tankard. Those of you who listened to my first bedtime story, a reading from the extraordinary and inspirational book by Petru Popescu titled The Encounter, will know that the narrative is set in the Amazonian rainforest and presents a view of the world that challenges the very core of global values and the contemporary ecological devastation that we're currently addressing. Today I'm going to read my recently published essay, A Few People, A Brief Moment in Time, Architectural Education Experiments 1987 to 1991, which was recently published in the Association of Architectural Educators journal, charrette number 6. Actually, what I'm reading is an abridged version, so if you want to read the full one, please do go and have a look there. Although structured around the formalities of an academic paper, this is in fact simply, I think, a story of a brief moment in time. So whilst it wasn't a conscious act, I now realise that there's a very strong connection between my essay and what is described in The Encounter. The work of Levi-Strauss, particularly on non-hierarchical social structures, and Mikhail Bakhtin's exploration of interpersonal narrative and ahistoricism strike at the very heart of The Encounter, just as they have been critical to the formulation of my story. The paper deals with issues that we must all address, of the relationship between politics and education, of the inequalities that are deeply embedded in architectural education, and the need to revisit alternative cultural models and constructs to challenge patriarchal hegemony. 30 years after these events took place, the almost unbroken march of the privatization and commodification of architectural education, and the increasing homogenization of a skills-based, profession-led curriculum, contextualized by political uncertainty, may be a moment to reconsider the potential embedded in an alternative, rebellious, feminist design, studio and practice. I hope if you listen to this reading that you will also be able to contextualize it by the murder of George Floyd and the call for all aspects of racism to be called out and dismantled forever. So, this essay draws together an account of pedagogic experiments in architectural education that happened at the Polytechnic of the South Bank of School of Architecture, which was the RIBA Part 2, between 1987 and 1991. Revisiting this period of holacratic autonomy and student-led collaborative education, I hope to shed some light on the value of manifesting transformative creative educational models. Charting an extraordinary period of student agency, this essay considers how the notion of social and individual political resistance, manifested as creative action, can inform a transformative and liberating methodology, understanding and challenging the relationship between education and politics, both in terms of architectural production, the individual and the institution, is central to the notion that architectural education is intrinsically linked to politics and hegemony. I'm just going to start from this point on, or just stop for a moment to read a quote by Walter Benjamin that is very important, I think, to this work. The value of information does not survive the moment in which it was new. It lives only at that moment. It has to surrender to it completely and explain itself to it without losing any time. A story is different. It does not expend itself. It preserves and concentrates its strength and is capable of releasing it even after a long time. So this story revisits the educational space formulated and made manifest by Kevin Rowbottom in the Department of Architecture at South Bank University, but it was the Polytechnic. This period of radical pedagogic experimentation and the events that occurred, as well as Rowbottom's writing, continue to be central to my practice as an architectural educator. The period coincides with the end of a political and social era in the UK, architectural education at the end of Margaret Thatcher's 8-year term as Conservative Prime Minister, and here it marks a teleology of rapid neoliberalisation, increasing globalisation concurrent with the changing capacities of information technology, financial deregulation, and the withdrawal of state commitment to universal higher education. The possibility of challenging the accepted hierarchical relationship between tutor and student, assuming the role of the former is to impart knowledge and critically social and cultural values to the latter, is considered, as is the assumption that a student's knowledge, experience and culture must be subsumed by the profession's accepted value system and means of production. Understanding the limitations of contemporary studio practices through readings of radical methodologies may represent an opportunity to consider our understanding of what architectural education might be, a process that can inspire, embody and respond to individual and collective experience. This is my story, a working class girl from a one-parent family living on a notorious so-called sink estate in North London. I was educated in a radical feminist socialist school and somehow managed not to drop out of architectural education, despite the sense of alienation and misogyny experienced throughout my degree and later in the profession itself. Deliberately anecdotal and frayed, it should be read as a collage of moments, a woven feminist fragment to be read as Chechkov's new urban formulary might be, by luxuriating in its pleasures. So, part 1, privatization, a political context. And I'm just going to start actually this part with a quote by Keith Louise Fulton from Stratégies Féministes, 1999. The university is a key site for reproducing the knowledge, culture and power in our society. But universities are complex places, not just reproducing, but also contesting and creating knowledges, culture and power. They are a priority for feminist work for several reasons. First, because their status and history are being used to authorise and reproduce patriarchal corporate and state power. Second, because universities are being dismantled as sites for accessible education, critical thought and political challenge. Third, because universities hold a responsibility to all the people of our society and world for whom they act as a repository of knowledge and a source of education. And fourth, because we need them. They can keep alive our hope and become our meeting place for a collective praxis. The demise and silencing of the British Art School as a politically critical avant-garde institution, it might be argued, began in 1968 with the so-called Hornsey College of Art uprising, during which students occupied the Crouch End Hill site. The college was founded in 1880 and survived until 1973, when under Edward Heath's Conservative government, it was merged with Enfield Technical, eventually becoming a department at Middlesex University. The privatisation of education and corporate suffocation of the independent art school through amalgamation into the so-called new universities began in the early 70s and ended in 1992, when UK polytechnics were given university status, so-called, marking the end of radical arts programmes in the UK. The straitjacketing of these sites of potential resistance and experimentation has been embedded strategically over a period of 40 years into a contemporary undergraduate system that is driven by league tables with employability and dovetailing with industry, particularly with the recent introduction of apprenticeships at its core. This context is now even more alarming, with the UK Foreign Affairs Select Committee identifying apparent evidence of Chinese interference on UK campuses with the aim of restricting academic freedom. Key also to this essay's context is the almost unbroken continuum since the late 19th century of a European architectural education system dominated by Beaux-Arts principles that institutionalised architectural education and established the architect as an elite specialist who must be apprenticed within the studio culture and ranked against their contemporaries in order to value and evaluate potential output. In the early 1980s, Thatcher was encouraged by her policy unit to pursue a war of attrition with the miners, but in essence she was waging war on anyone who adopted socialist values. The role of the profession in suppressing the politicisation of architectural education is self-serving. The status quo must be maintained if it is to operate successfully within the capitalist system, a system which in the 1980s was booming. It is 1976 and London appears to be in chaos. The streets are filthy and full of rubbish. Empty buildings are boarded up and squatted by hippies and revolutionaries. I walk with my mum to the Archway Road to visit the commie shop, as people on the estate called it, the first vegan food shop and cafe in North London. I can't remember what we buy, but this definitely isn't the world of Findus frozen dinners I'm used to. The people here represent political danger, but I understand the real threat is the Cold War and the nuclear bomb. A couple of years later, I join a youth theatre in the church on Jackson's Lane, saved by those protesting hippies. We write a play about a post-nuclear living hell, Spit at the Wind, and the campaign for nuclear disarmament says we can go on tour with them. But my mum says I can't skip school for that. Instead, I go to anti-Thatcher rallies and watch Ari Up, the lead singer of the girl punk band The Slits, who has managed to leave home at 14, same age as me, and is actually doing something. The miners took pride in working class values, and the art school was a site of radical creativity and political resistance. Both positions were completely contrary to the culture of competitive individualism of the Beaux-Arts system and Thatcherism. The privatisation of education through the introduction of student loans is a similar mechanism to Thatcher's selling off of social housing and the credit boom. Its aim was to suffocate education as a space for revolutionary ideology through the chaining of students to lifelong debt. The financial burden of a course necessitating 5 years of study and the perceived employment crisis fueled by political instability has led architectural education further and further towards the skills-based industry fodder approach I discussed earlier. Students view themselves as individuals in competition with one another for those elusive, well-paid jobs, not only to live, but to pay off the debt. 1983. I am 19 years old, a self-confessed party animal who, seduced by Sartre and the intellectuals of the left bank, aestheticised philosophy and radical ideas. Ian Curtis has been dead for 3 years. I arrive in Manchester and, despite having my purse stolen seconds after I step off the night bus, fall madly, passionately in love with this beautiful wasteland of derelict industrial buildings and filthy junk-filled canals. I see absolute beauty everywhere. I also begin my architectural journey in the studio by establishing pretty quickly that the study of architecture is not what I had imagined. Self-congratulatory, retrospective and overtly racist and sexist, I am in total shock at the reticence and ambivalence of my all-male white tutors. I live very happily in a flat in a deck-accessed block in Hume, a large social housing estate built in the 70s. If I was on my own in the flat at the weekend, a local family would invite me to Sunday dinner. Kids and dogs and arguing. The mother saw me as a key to helping her children get out of the closed world that she lived in. I loved their busy, crazy, off-the-wall space. The School of Architecture was located right on the edge of this deprived neighbourhood, now demolished and much of it replaced by privatised and student housing. Yet we never once discussed it formally on the course. The majority, 95% of the students, were white, middle class and from families who had strong connections with the profession. My peer group appeared to have no political views of their own. During a studio conversation, I mentioned the poor quality of our neighbouring housing, cockroaches, cold bridges, noise, broken lifts. A student responded, "My dad, an architect, says you could put some people in a palace and they turn it into a shithole." Disgusted, I go to the library and read as much as I can about the social history of the city. I am going to have to educate myself. Part 2, 1988, a narrative. Having been educated to BA Honours Part 1, REBA Part 1 at an old university, weighed down by the unquestioning acceptance of the profession with its embedded myths, conventions, misogyny, racism and homophobia, like many of my new PG Dip cohort, I had been ready to leave the profession and explore alternative career routes. But in May 1987, an invitation to a PG Dip crit by a student friend already studying at South Bank Polytechnic transformed my view completely. The day was exhilarating, and I came away feeling inspired, challenged and desperate to start studying again. Architecture at South Bank had a very different philosophy underpinning it to my BA education. I began my studies with about 20 home students and 10 German students studying for the first year only. The course leader, Kevin Rowbottom, had a collective approach to education and forensic expectations for research and critique, which generated an atmosphere of creative, multidisciplinary actions, be they with a rotring pen or a chainsaw. He represented the contemporary role of the architect as servant to the political elite and posited the potential for the profession to effect social change. The 2 years were viewed as a complete journey. Year 1 would be spent defining a thesis, Year 2 refining and representing it. Rowbottom's critical analysis of the profession and our developing understanding of the context to practice contextualise our production as political action, and the studios on Wandsworth Road in which we worked were robust, dirty spaces where we argued, constructed and drew. This was very much our territory and regarded as our social space too. Through a series of workshops run with the year above us, we were introduced to mapping, coding, printing, collage and superimposition, scratch models and autodynamism. This process allowed us to be super productive, no longer looking for the perfect conceptual idea or paralysed by the blank sheet of paper. We engaged in a process of making that enabled us to explore design processes intuitively. The act of collaborative drawing production was central to studio at this time, an attack on the notions of authorship and individual genius nurtured by the academic institution and embedded by the profession. The sketch was despised and ignored as a vague, non-committal irrelevance, a means of representation that fostered an ideology of the male genius at work. The pressure and competitiveness students have to struggle with was not part of our experience, and there were many other spaces of discourse and pleasure beyond the studio that fueled and inspired our work. Drawings were made as constructions without the convention of line on tracing paper. They were grown using soil and seeds, cast, stolen, reappropriated. Representations were overlaid with superimposed material fragments, other people's drawings, photographs. Authorship was redundant. Collaboration was central and essential to a collective creative means of making. For weeks, our cohort worked tirelessly on the communal drawing, singular, continuous, constructed on a never-ending roll of tracing paper that would be a competition entry and academic submission for the students in the year above. The drawing, no longer a representation of the status quo or an a nostalgic artifice, was understood as polemical rather than representational, an agency through which active politicised methodologies could evolve. Studying in an environment that rejected all accepted conventions and the complacency that was the mainstay of provincial UK architectural education was radical and liberating for all. The Slaughterhouse exhibition was our first collaborative action that interacted with the public. An exhibition of work of the year above us, we helped install beautiful constructions made of fragments of cast and constructive elements and found pieces. Contemporary poetry, text imaginings, and ruthless forensic readings of key texts and revolutionary artist action making from the early 20th century inspired our position and process. We attended the Croker's lecture at the ICA, read Panic Encyclopedia, and discovered a lot of people who really interested us, notably Hannah Vowles and Glyn Banks, the artists of Art in Ruins. The environment of that year enabled me to investigate design as a patriarchal construct and have that position valued and supported. The notion that architecture could be created through a feminist methodology, that a new language and typologies could be evolved, had manifested itself through my research and response to collective studio activity. Part 3, 1989, Panic Crash, the collective. This seemingly idyllic, if challenging period appears to have abruptly halted when Rowbottom was removed from his postgraduate duties to teach undergraduate first year. The symbolism of what might be described, it's ridiculous, but described as his demotion, was not lost on us, and we held several meetings, wrote statements and manifestos. This process manifested in our rejecting the staff reintroduced to teach us, and the whole cohort joined undergraduate first year, attending their lectures and collaborating on their installation projects. These felt like extraordinary times. We were, to an extent, still being educated by Rowbottom. No one questioned the fact that we were in a year of students who had just started. We worked on their projects with them, evolving them collectively. I distinctly remember approaching the building on Wandsworth Road one morning to see a crane hoisting crushed cars onto the roof. When I got up there, I found Kevin and some students getting organised to cut up the cars with chainsaws. The difficult atmosphere amongst the staff was palpable and no doubt exacerbated by the student body. We became more and more intent on taking control of our education, and we rejected much of the rest of the curriculum delivered by those other tutors. The studio became a safe space and a place where, although Rowbottom was setting the agenda via his teaching in first year, we were to a greater or lesser extent autonomous. For a few weeks we worked together on a competition entry inspired by the Atrocity exhibition by J.G. Ballard. This was a period when little drawing happened, as we were constantly casting and modelling. Engaging in the process of autodynamism, the project concluded with the construction of a huge plaster cast model of an intervention around the site of the Birmingham motorway system, known as Spaghetti Junction. Made from casts of our bodies and fragments of the cars still on the department roof, it filled a huge space, probably about, I would say, 12 feet, maybe about, no, bigger, maybe 3-4 metres by 6 metres. It was the day we locked the door to the studio, actually to create a safe space for the women students to make casts of their bodies, that caused everything to change more drastically. The locked room, it seemed, so angered the acting head that he destroyed our model, smashed to pieces. He left it shattered across the studio. We were absolutely devastated, and to add to our distress, a couple of days later, we discovered that Kevin was gone. We felt like wild animals set free for a brief spell, only to be unceremoniously chained and re-caged. For a short period we attended the set lectures, but soon started walking out in protest. We could no longer tolerate the sexist terminology or white colonial positioning so embedded in their content. Furious, we gave the newly appointed head of school notice we were leaving the course, en masse. To our amazement, his response was to offer us, quite literally, the budget to run the course ourselves, even getting permission to negotiate which, if any, tutors from the department we would utilise for core teaching and what they could or could not teach us. I remember the first meeting we held. 100% commitment from every student was required if we were to make this work. We took control of everything and immediately decided to only have departmental guidance for our dissertations. All other tutors would be employed by us from outside of the institution. This group included artists, poets and performance artists and building product manufacturers, but interestingly, no architects. Part 4, Feminist Action, Class, Empowerment, Opportunity. It was my job to write a manifesto for the studio, and for what it's worth, this is it. Our studio is constructed as a form of resistance to the violence committed against the collective in contemporary architectural education. Notions of hierarchy, patriarchy and control in Britain are constantly manipulated in order to maintain the status quo. This is fundamental to the education system, which is no longer a site of experimentation and social action. We have been brainwashed into accepting the repetitive production mindset that ensures the regurgitation and endless revision of what has gone before. Already a slow, lumbering beast, unable to respond effectively or creatively to social or cultural change, architectural theory is literally shuddering to a halt. Led by fetishized engineering and technology, it is simply another manifestation of patriarchy. No ideas are possible in this context, only a self-reflexive notion of a kind of poetic masturbation, an architecture of parts put together to form a Meccano kit to signify technological process. And the antidote to a culture of neurosis and alienation is another kind of architecture, a Disney version of infantile fantasy based on historic nostalgia, a tranquilizer dissipating the nation's potential for political action when not physically exhausted by labour. Contemporary architectural theory has failed. Its focus on the individual is self-indulgent, maintaining a 19th century obsession with morality. Society and the commune must be valued. By celebrating the chaos and panic inherent in contemporary society, architectural education can be the vehicle to expose the potential for different methodologies, programme and form. We are challenging the comfortable, rational, contextual. The notion of context is completely redundant and irrelevant, as the contemporary urban context is merely mimicking and responding to the hierarchies and power structures embodied in an architecture of the past. So we arranged for Kevin to teach us at night. We let him in via the fire escape and he helped us to get things structured. Our new externally sourced design tutors were extremely challenging teachers, but the relationship between tutor and student had effectively completely transformed. They were more like critical friends, helping us to evolve our individual polemic into major projects and enabling us and supporting us to achieve a Marxist feminist space in our studio. The thesis and the political position that this period framed became the mechanism for a methodology that was ruthlessly adhered to. For technology, we built fragments of our building propositions in the studio at full scale. When we felt there was a gap in our knowledge, we filled it as a group, inviting the first years to attend workshops and readings. We learned that explaining what you know to others is a brilliant way of understanding better yourself. In May, we said goodbye to our German partners who were returning home to continue their studies, and we went off to spend the summer researching for our dissertations. Bakhtinian notions of intercultural communication and the potential to identify multidisciplinary creative space within those intersections were adopted intuitively. Our cohort was made up of individuals from a diverse demographic who used their individual cultural experiences to create those methodologies that were informed by rigorous investigations into the spaces between our knowledge and understanding. No longer working to predetermine programs or briefs, but instead responding to knowledge, analysis, and shared principles, we evolved critical, collective, and individual programs that challenged our understanding of typology, framing our work with theoretical rigor and specificity. On November the 9th, 1989, we hear reports that filter through about the Berlin Wall. It was about to fall. Some of us phone our friends in Germany. There is a sense that things are changing, but we also know that unlike our cousins not so far away, the UK remains a political space supported and reinforced by the media. When the department tutors took it upon themselves to enter into and disrupt our allocated studio spaces, we attempted to negotiate and debate. On one occasion, a very angry tutor stated that my project, a refuge for abused women and children in Hackney, had no technological understanding whatsoever and would fail. My proposal was using the simplest of domestic construction techniques, a straightforward strategy that would not have challenged any contractor, but manipulated to create spaces without program. I wasted a valuable opportunity for creative feedback by inviting this tutor to my crit, where I had nothing on the wall. I simply drew the technology, as he deemed to call it, as he asked me to, on a flip chart. These were terrifying moments. We were literally being forced to confront the hierarchies we had chosen to reject in order to defend our work in the crudest of ways. Stan Sherrington became head of school in 1990. That was close to the end of our final weeks in the department. An advocate, he managed to keep one foot in both camps. He enabled the institution to stay as far away from us as possible and supported us when we needed it. The confrontation stopped and we worked harder than ever. Despite our visiting tutors, mostly we educated each other. The assumption that we would all pass was absolute, we all did. And that year, South Bank Polytechnic won the RIBA silver medal, as Dr. Tonya Carlos, and a number of us visited other schools to talk about our work. This example of student agency was valued both by the institution, in the end, when they talked about it later on, and the RIBA, when they did their external examining. The external examiners were very interested in what we'd done and were very complimentary. On the 13th of June 1990, just a couple of days before our end of year exhibition, police in Bucharest attacked the School of Architecture, where a sit-in of students and hunger strikers were protesting about the self-styled new government that had come to power after the revolution. The School of Architecture was completely destroyed and many students were badly beaten. A few weeks later, we welcomed those same students to London. Invited by UK members of Europan, we met our contemporaries half starved to death by Ceausescu and nearly beaten to death by their countrymen. Like the Paris uprising of 1968 and Rome in the same year, art and architecture schools, we were reminded, were the site of political confrontation. I now just want to quickly read, I know I'm running out of time, but I quickly want to read a quote by Aldo Van Eyck, a piece of text by him, which I think is really beautiful. And it says, "Take off your shoes and walk along the beach through the ocean's last thin sheet of water, gliding landwards and seawards. You feel reconciled in a way you would not feel if there were a forced dialogue between you and either one or other of these great phenomena. For here, in between land and ocean, in this in-between realm, something happens to you that is quite different from the seaman's alternating nostalgia. No landward yearning from the sea, no seaward yearning from the land, no yearning for the alternative, no escape from one into the other." Before completing my studies, Sherrington asked me if I would like to teach in the department. I seized the opportunity to go on learning through collaboration, continuing very much in the spirit of this transformative period in my life. And I think trying to find that space that Aldo Van Eyck describes, the in-between space where something different and transformative might happen. I've now been teaching for 30 years and the past 20 in third year undergraduate. Over this period, I've become increasingly frustrated by the growing influence of the profession on architectural education and the insistent veering toward political conservatism and instruction-based learning, a condition exacerbated by increasing student numbers and decreasing funding and resourcing against the backdrop of a political shift to the right. Radical feminist practice, regardless of discipline or context, is, I believe, as marginalised as it ever was. Its threatening presence in the second half of the 20th century appears simply to have been rendered powerless through a process of commodification and co-opting by patriarchy. In response, I've returned to the education and experience described in this essay for inspiration and methodology. The futility of training architects rather than teaching them to learn through experimentation, analysis, collective interaction and theoretical discourse, and to engage in the unknown and unpredictable has become central to my teaching, manifesting in an interrogation and creative resurrection of what, how, and in what context I had learnt. The value of understanding the contemporary political context, the role of the architect in maintaining the status quo, the notion of form to programme, and the techniques of representation and investigation described earlier are central to studio practice. And that process, I would have to say, is not linear. Like this essay, the work evolves out of an assemblage of fragments researched, found, contextualised and analysed. Students are given each other's work and projects to work on and present. There is no end in the conventional sense of the word. Production simply stops when time runs out. Dangerous as this may seem, the students produce work to match learning outcomes and assessment criteria, but the drawings and models arise at specific points in the process. Almost 50 years since the political moments that marked the beginning of this essay, and just over 150 years since the publication of Das Kapital, it could be argued that Marx's tenet, all that is solid melts into air, has come to pass. Marx's commentary on the industrial transformation of society through mechanisation precedes the electronic and now digital revolution that is completely transforming contemporary global society. Artificial intelligence and the potential that humans will no longer need to think, make decisions or control our environment is the future context that goes hand in hand with a Blade Runner 2049 apocalyptic vision of a natural world that is completely destroyed by the worst of our consumerist excesses. Architecture can be transformative, catalytic, alchemical. Yet against this super fast changing context, the profession appears to be more like the slow reactionary beast I described earlier. The potential for a radical utopian architectural education seems to be all but lost, its final death throes manifesting in funding strategies that include models such as the apprenticeship scheme, where the School of Architecture is not just beholden to and policed by the government, but by the employer and the profession. As we stand on the precipice of global catastrophe, the overdue search for alternative solutions to our social and political context begins. The opportunity for architectural educators to challenge the course laid out for us may be a brief moment in time, initiated by a few people in search of radical change, but revisiting the experiments of the past may make useful models for the future. And I just want to end actually with a quote from Philip Pullman from his book, His Dark Materials. We have to be all those difficult things, like cheerful and kind and curious and patient, and we've got to study and think and work hard, all of us, in all our different worlds, and then we'll build. Somewhere in the garden a nightingale was singing, and a little breeze touched her hair and stirred the leaves overhead, and somewhere else, in each and one of the parallel worlds, a nightingale would sing and a little breeze would be stirring the leaves in the botanic garden. And then what? Build what? The Republic of Heaven, said Lyra. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.